before we get started, I do need to take a moment and give a bit of a content warning for what we're going to talk about. I think I sort of introduced this yesterday with this group, right?
Yes.
Because of when Lise Meitner is, her work is part of the story, pretty fundamentally, of the discovery of the atomic bomb and World War II. Part of this unit is building up to how did we discover things like atomic bombs. But if I'm going to talk about Lise Meitner and her life, which is impacted pretty extremely by what is happening in Germany in the years leading up to World War II, I'm not willing, I don't think it's ethical as a teacher to skim over things like the Holocaust, right? Fundamentally, I think if I'm teaching about World War II, I don't think you can teach about World War II and not teach about the Shoah, right? I don't think that's an acceptable or ethical thing to do. Because part of my core beliefs is that this kind of thing can only happen when people allow themselves to look away and to pretend it's not happening, and that pretending things don't happen is how stuff like this ends up occurring. So we are going to talk about some really heavy subjects today. And I just want to be sure that everyone knows that's happening before we get into it, because it is a hard topic. I know that you've heard your history teachers talk about things like hard history before. And while this is really hard history, I want to be really clear that this isn't just a history story for a lot of people. For many people, including, I think, almost certainly a number of people in this room, this isn't just a piece of history. It's part of their story. It's part of their family's story. It's a piece of their personal history. And for many people, it's a really painful piece of personal history. There is almost certainly at least one, probably multiple people in this room whose family history was altered because of what happened at this point, who have ancestors that fled, who are the descendants of survivors, or who have ancestors and family members who weren't able to survive this. And so a thing that I need to make sure that we're all really clear on is we can't just treat this like it is something theoretical. We can't just treat this like it's just a piece of history that happened a long time ago, because it is personal to a lot of people here. This was allowed to happen in part because there were groups of people that respect and empathy and understanding was not extended to. There were sets of people in our history that were not viewed as being worthy of being treated with respect and dignity. And as we are looking back on this period of time, it's really important to me that we extend these people respect and dignity in death, because the fact that they were not extended that respect and dignity is part of what allowed this kind of atrocity to happen. So first, ground rule for today, we will treat this subject with solemnity, with respect, and the victims of it with dignity. That means this is not an area that is acceptable to make jokes about. Can we all agree to that?
Yes.
Great. The second thing I want to say is that, second ground rule, actually, before we go any further. There's this framework for understanding how genocides can happen. It's called the 10 stages of genocide. And the 10th stage is denial. It's pretending that it never happened. There are people in this world who make the claim that this didn't happen. And that is incredibly dangerous. It's part of that whole pattern we see of erasing, pretending people never existed, that, right, this is a really dangerous thing, the denialism. So we are not going to make any space, a thing that is absolutely unacceptable. I will not allow denial of the Holocaust or any genocide in my classroom. Right? We don't pretend the Holocaust didn't happen. That's not okay. So there's not going to be any space for denialism. I also want to be clear, some of you are coming in and you are ready, you're expecting this to be a painful subject, And maybe it's a painful subject that you have been, having days of remembrance about already, that you already have some sort of relationship with this subject. Other people might be coming in and realizing for the first time, oh, they would have come for me too. So some of you might find yourselves in the experience of discovering solidarity with the set of people who were victims for the first time. And that can be pretty painful for some folks. There's also going to be some folks who, when we are having this discussion, are going to be realizing that there's a lot of connections to things that are happening in our country recently, especially in the last couple of weeks. And that is honestly really scary. It scares me when I see those connections. So I just want us all to know, today's lesson is going to be a hard one. I'm not setting out here with the intent of making you feel upset or scared. And at the same time, I don't think it's ethical for me to teach about World War II and not address this, right? I think that turning away is not acceptable. So if anyone at any point feels that this is too much, I want you all to know that if you need to step outside, you can do that. If you need to leave the classroom, go for a walk, stand in the rain for a moment and feel yourself in your body in nature, you can do that. If you need to go to the bathroom and wash your face because you feel like you're going to cry, you can go do that. Please make sure that if you leave my classroom, you're behaving in a way that isn't going to draw the ire of other teachers, so that I can continue to protect the ability to say, hey, if you need to step out, you can do so. So make sure that you're behaving appropriately. But I've never had any issues with that, with folks leaving and misbehaving during this. So if you need to step out, you may absolutely do so. And I would ask one last thing for us. If somebody does need to step out, we'd be respectful of their need to do so. Okay? You don't know what somebody's history is. You don't know what their connection to this material might be. You don't know how deep that pain might go for some people. So if people need to step out, we don't judge them for doing that. Okay? All right. Is there anything that anyone here needs before we move into this? Or any other ground rules that folks feel like I missed about this? Okay. So, when last we left off with Lise Meitner, she has overcome a bunch of institutional, baked-in sexism. She managed to make her way into a university that had, despite systems that are designed to keep women out of higher education. She has got a prestigious job at the University of Berlin, where she's a teacher, right? She's a professor there. She's built a life for herself in Germany. And she has a community of people around her. One of the things I keep saying is we've hit the point in the story where all these people kind of know each other, right?
Albert Einstein is in the photo.
Albert Einstein's right here. It's a younger Albert Einstein. Right here is Lise Meitner. This is her lab partner, Otto Hahn.
Who's the other lady?
The other lady is Ingrid Frank. I don't know a ton about Ingrid Frank. She would have been either a physicist or a chemist. The other famous person here that you might learn about at some point is this is Fritz Haber, who invented the Haber process. He's probably the single individual scientist responsible for both saving and killing the highest number of lives. He invented nitrogen fertilizer, which has allowed us to feed the world and saved countless people from starvation. And he also worked with the German government during World War I to create chemical weapons that would later on be used against us. So this is some of the community that Lise Meitner has built around herself. She's living in Germany. She actually even ends up she converts to Lutheranism, which is a very German sect of Christianity. She's built a life here. And that is the situation that she's in when our story advances. Because at this period in time, there is a sort of political philosophy that is spreading across Europe. And this political philosophy is something called ethno-nationalism. And what ethno-nationalism is it is the belief that a country, that states, should basically be built around a specific like ethnic group, a specific set of people who are like the real Germans or the real Americans. And that's who, I see that look. How many of you have heard somebody talk about like, oh, the real Americans, like when you hear statements like that, take a moment and think, who do they think is a real American? Who gets to count as a true American, a real American? And recognize, oh wait, what are they actually saying with that? Are they saying that there is a set of people that the laws are supposed to protect and then a different set of people that laws are supposed to bind? Are they saying that this is who the country is really for and that anyone who's outside of this narrow set of bounds, doesn't deserve equal protection under the law? That's what ethno-nationalism is about. It's about saying like there is a true set of people who are the real citizens and that everyone else who's outside of that narrow bound isn't a real citizen. And you will see that you'll see people in America talk like this. Like, this is absolutely a political philosophy that you will hear from people. Folks who say that the real Americans in the heartland, don't believe in such and such, and aren't engaged in such and such. And that set of real Americans is usually white, and at least calls themselves Christian, even if they don't actually believe in Christian values. And is usually men, which is, like, if you think about this for even a moment, you realize, like, wait, you've already cut out over half of American population, and it's probably cisgender and straight, which is to say not a member of the queer community, right? And that's what the real American is. And by that definition, I'm not a real American. And I think there's probably actually very few people in this room who would actually fit under that very, very narrow definition. And if you do fit under it, like, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with being like, look, loads of my friends are straight. But there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong, like, I'm white, there's nothing wrong with being white. But what is wrong is when you start saying, these are the only people who count, right? That's where things get scary. And that is a political philosophy that's taking root at this time. Part of what's that? Ethno-nationalism is like the broad category of when you believe that your country exists for a small set of people.
Do we have to write down like a bunch of the stuff on
It is up to you whether you want to write this down. If it feels more comfortable today to just sit and listen until we get to the more sciencey parts, that's okay. I know that this lesson can be a lot, so if trying to take notes is hard during this, that's all right. Yes, I will.
Are you going to go over what all of this stuff over there means?
Yes, I will go over what all these different things mean. Because I know there's a couple words on here that are probably new to some of you. So, what happens in Germany is after World War I, which Germany loses, and I want to be really clear, World War I is not like World War II. World War II is like very clear, like these countries were like, there's very obvious and clear lines about evil in World War II. World War I is just straight up the horrors of war all the way through, right? Germany loses World War I, gets hit with a bunch of sanctions, is paying a bunch of money to other countries. There's a bunch of things happening in Germany. And on the one side of things, Germany is a vibrant, multicultural society under the Weimar Republic. It's the center of queer culture in Europe at this period in time. There's this place called the Institute for the Sexual Sciences that is, the actual name is in German, it's a rough translation. That's in Berlin, that's like studying the science of what it is to be queer and is figuring out things like, hey, what does estrogen actually do? What does testosterone do? How do we give people HRT, hormone replacement therapy? How do we do like sex confirmation surgeries? Like all the trans science, that existed 100 years ago in Berlin.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So there's like this whole vibrant culture there. It's a mixed race society. Like I know that like the picture you have in your head of somebody living in Germany at this point in time, there's probably a very specific image you have, and the image probably looks like that. But I want to remind you just like America is not all people who look like Chris Evans. I'm glad you enjoyed that, Daphne. The same is true of Germany, right? Like Germany has loads of black people who live there, and those folks have like intermarried with people who are white. They've got mixed race kids. Like it's a multicultural society. There's loads of people from all over who live there, right? It is not a monolith as a society. Yes.
Is it like accepting of people who don't identify?
During the Weimar Republic, which is like what happens between World War I and World War II, before the Nazi Party takes in, it's a pretty open and accepting society. And at the same time, there's also a set of people living in Germany who are feeling of, what at first is just kind of a vague sense of discontent, this feeling that they were supposed to have access to more, that something that they are owed has been denied them, that they were entitled to something that hasn't been given to them. And what the Nazi Party does is they realize there is all this like discontent, and if they can direct that and like seize control of this sense of feeling unhappy and give it an outlet and give it an enemy, that they can use that to elevate themselves to power. And I want to be really clear. Has anyone here either heard of or read The Diary of Anne Frank?
Oh, yeah.
Right? There's this quote in there near the end where Anne Frank says, like, despite it all, I still believe that people are fundamentally good. I'm gonna tell you something, I'm a biologist by training. Like, I studied people and human evolution. And if there is one thing that humans have evolved to do, it is love one another. Like, humans cannot survive on our own. We have to exist in community. We have to care for one another. That is baked about as deeply into us as anything can be, the ability to care for one another is, right? People are not hateful, like, at our core. It's actually really, really hard to convince people to act with spite. It's really hard to convince people to allow to hurt somebody. And there's a huge amount of groundwork that has to be done in order to make that possible. To give you a sense for this, right now in the United States, there are 12 trans athletes at the college level. Like in the NCAA, literally a dozen. We have just passed an executive order forbidding those people from being allowed to commit. So like literally laws being passed to target a dozen ladies, right? Like 12 people were like, why would that be on the president's thing? Like, why would anyone care about that? It's 12 people, right? But if you look at what's happened in the US in the last like 8 years, and you go back, you'll see constant New York Times articles about this, right? There's more articles in one newspaper about this than there are athletes.
That's kind of insane.
Right? Yeah. That's manufactured hatred. Right? That is taking real people. Because I guarantee you, if you were to like actually hang out with one of these ladies, you'd go like, oh yeah, that's just a lady and she's really good at swimming. Whatever. But when people think about this topic, they're not thinking about an actual person. They're thinking about an idea of those people, which has been sold to them over the course of years of deliberate propaganda. And if you start learning to look for this, you will see this happening in our culture all the time. All those articles about, rising crime and, scary things and population changes, it's all existing to create a sense of fear around certain groups. Because if you're somebody who's trying to come to power by creating a sense of hatred, you don't want somebody to hear trans people and think of their science teacher Hannah. They don't want you to think of somebody who you spent a year with and who loves you, right? That's not the picture that they want in your heads when they say, think about trans people. They want you to think about some imaginary boogeyman. When they talk about immigrants, they don't want you to think about Beatrice. They want you to think about some hypothetical being, right? Who's here to, all the nasty stereotypes. Most of y'all, I don't think, are honestly capable of really truly hating me or Beatrice, right? I don't think most people are. I've never met a person who actually knew me who truly hated me, right? That's not how people work. But the idea of us, right? If you can remove this idea of this concept of us as people and instead have us be, an idea, that's something that you can teach people to hate. And that's what's happening in the years leading up. It is not a fast process. It's not like, we woke up one day and it was the Holocaust. There were years of dehumanizing propaganda about Jewish people, about communists, about Jehovah's Witnesses, about the Roma and the Sinti, about all these groups of people. And it took time and work and effort in order to make this happen. So what all of us have to do is we have to learn to recognize when we are being told to view a set of people as a concept instead of flesh and blood, real humans who are worthy of our love and empathy and respect. We have to learn to recognize when we're being told to think of them as a category instead of as individuals. And we have to reject them. Because this is what happens if we don't reject it. It's worth noting, even with all the propaganda, watching violence unfold in front of you is more than most people are capable of bearing. So a big part of how this was accomplished was removing these people from the public eye. So there's a thing that happens, and the official name for this is the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. Sounds like a reasonable law, right? We're going to restore the civil service. But what this law did is it took all these groups of people who are outside this really narrow sliver, this really narrow ethno-nationalist ideal of what Germany was for, of who Germany was for, and said those people are not allowed to serve in these public positions of respect and power. It said, if you're Jewish, you're not allowed to be a police officer or a soldier or a teacher. It's acts to remove these people from public view. Just like when we see things like Trump trying to discharge all trans members from the military, or all this stuff about DEI things and all of the government websites that are being scrubbed of DEI stuff. It's really just taking, heroes who are people of color out of the public view. It's about pulling it out of vision. Because no one can sit and watch this kind of violence happen in front of them. But maybe you can convince people to look away and let it happen. When these laws are passed, they're also known as the Nuremberg laws. It's no longer legal for Lise Meitner to be a professor in Berlin. She is no longer a paid employee. But she stays. She stays in Berlin. And she stays at the university, and she continues working in the lab. She's just not an employee anymore. She's not paid. Everything she's doing is unofficial. But this is the life that she has built for herself. And she stays. Because if you leave, that's giving up on the idea that your country can be better. And that's a really hard thing to do, right? She's no longer allowed to be an employee, but she stays. She keeps doing the work. Time passes, things get worse. The Nazis come fully into power, and one of the things that they do is they pass laws that strip Jewish people of their German citizenship. That takes this idea of, yes,
Well, I thought she wasn't Jewish anymore.
so the thing about Judaism is many things. It is a religion, it's an ethnicity, it's a intergenerational project to repair the world. She is not a practicing Jew, but in the eyes of the Nazis, she is still a Jew.
How do they know she's a Jew?
They define it as if any one of your 4 grandparents are Jewish. I mean, there's paperwork, right? Like, people have birth certificates, people have passports. Yeah. There are records of these things. So she has stayed. One of the things that the German government does, that the Nazis in particular do, is they begin to strip Jewish people of their citizenship. This is a really, really scary thing, because when you become stateless, you lose access to a lot of protections under international law. My grandfather-in-law fled Germany during the Holocaust when he was a kid, and I have seen his paperwork where he's got these certificates that say, this is his name, this is his birthday, this is information, this is not a passport, he is not a German citizen, making it really clear on this bit of paperwork that, here he is, here's his ID. This ID does not mean has access to any of the rights or privileges associated with being a citizen. And he was really lucky because he managed to get out to England, which was willing to take in Jewish children, but was not willing to take in people above a certain age. So he managed to get out, but his older sister did not manage to escape. So when you see people talking about passport stuff, where the U.S. Has just, so as of very recently, the last few weeks, I can't get a passport with my gender on it. That's no longer an option for me.
Wait, you can't get a
I can't get a passport with my gender on it because I'm trans. That's a really scary thing, right? When we begin, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide, right? I'm going to keep everything off of paperwork. But that's a really scary thing. And I have plenty of trans friends who can't hide as effectively, right? Who are much easier to look at and know that they're trans. Whereas I'm here in front of, and I can stand in front of you and wear a dress and people will go, that's a woman, and I can let the government keep believing that. But yeah, this is scary stuff. Lise Meitner, when she gets this, when this happens, when Jewish people are stripped of their citizenship, even then, she stays. Because she's still got her Austrian passport, and that provides her with its own protections. But eventually what happens is Germany begins to invade its neighbors. And one of the first places it invades is Austria. And as is the case with occupations, what people who are occupying other countries do is just like with Russia and Poland, there's this claim of actually you were always part of us, right? Actually Austria was always part of Germany. Actually Austria has always been Aryan, which is their native ethnic group. And when that happens, and suddenly there's no such thing as Austrian citizenship, there's only German citizenship, and she can't have access to that, that is when Lise Meitner realizes she has to run. But she doesn't want to leave with a bunch of suitcases and all her stuff, because if she shows up at the border and she's got a big suitcase with all her worldly possessions in it, somebody's going to stop her and be like, oh, are you fleeing the country? And they'll realize that she's Jewish, and that'll be it for her. So she can't take anything with her. Her lab partner, Otto Hahn, gives her his mother's diamond wedding ring that she puts in her pocket in case she needs to bribe a border guard. And she leaves the country with nothing but the clothes on her back and this ring in her pocket. And thankfully, she does manage to escape. She gets out, despite having waited, honestly, scarily long to leave. But she does get out. She does survive. And she's going to have to spend, the rest of her career, she's doing this work remotely, like via letters, still communicating with her lab partner, Otto Hahn, who stays in Berlin. But she does survive.
Where does she go?
She goes to Copenhagen in Denmark.
Oh, how old was she when she?
I don't know her exact age.
Wait, no,
She's fully an adult.
So are you gonna say that people from the Nazis started?
Yes. Because a lot of people are not as lucky as Lise Meitner and do not make it out. So there's this set of people that like the ethno-nationalist version of Germany is like viewing and holding up as the ideal. And that set of people, one, it's white people. And I know that in your head, when you think about a German in this period of time, there's probably a particular image you have in your head. I want you to take a moment and recognize that image is not necessarily accurate. There were plenty of people of color living in Germany in the 1930s. The Nazi government tracks down almost every single mixed race kid in Germany. This is like a truly horrifying thing. They track down every mixed race kid and they forcibly sterilize them, which means they give them operations that remove their ability to have children. Because they believe in racial purity. And they don't want the existence of mixed race people is inherently a threat to this view that has this one narrow set of what a real German is. Because to allow mixed race people is to acknowledge that people are people who are capable of loving one another, that we are all human, right? They say that Germany is for Christians. And particular groups of Christians, right? Like it's not so welcoming to Catholics either. But specifically the big targets of that are going to be Jewish people. And again, this is not something that you can do, out in daylight where everyone can see it. This kind of thing has to be moved out of the public eye. And so one of the big tools that's used is Jewish people are effectively rounded up and put into these really limited neighborhoods that they're not allowed to leave. They're effectively prisoners in their own neighborhoods. These neighborhoods are called ghettos. You're probably familiar with the word ghetto, and I want you to understand where that word comes from. A ghetto is a neighborhood that is a prison, that people are prevented from leaving. That's where that word comes from. So when you have people in America who use that word is a political choice. When somebody says this neighborhood is a ghetto, what they're saying is someone has done this to us. They have created a circumstance that is inescapable, where people don't have access to what they need in order to thrive or maybe even survive. That's what a ghetto is. And this is why you oftentimes historically will see such allyship between like the African American community and the Jewish American communities, because there's this recognition that this thing that's been done has been done to Jewish people in the past, and there are parallels. The Nazi Party believes that there's this like ethnic group that they've made up this whole like make-believe history for that they're calling the Aryans. That's the ethnic group that it's for. And other ethnic groups, in particular traveling peoples, like the Roma and the Sinti, are probably the second biggest targets after Jewish people. They believe that Germany is for straight people and for cisgender people. Trans people are some of the first targets. Trans and queer people are some of the first targets of the Nazis. all of that medical research into like how to do hormone replacement therapy and sex reassignment surgeries. How many of you have ever like seen pictures of the Nazis burning books, or at least know that book burning is a Nazi thing? Those pictures of the books, that's the research of the Sexual Institute. That's the research on like how estrogen works, how testosterone works. And the director of that institute was a gay Jewish man doing research on how to help queer people live their best lives. And that's the books that were burned, right? The Nazis believed that Germany is for able-bodied people and for neurotypical people. Disabled people are also going to be one of the biggest targets. A huge number of disabled people are just killed. And an even larger number of them are also sterilized, made incapable of having children. And of course, political enemies are some of the earliest targets, right? There's a famous poem that starts, "First it came for the communists," right? So the people whose political philosophy basically boils down to, we're all in this together, we all have an obligation to one another, right? That political philosophy is incompatible with Nazism. And they are also rounded up and put in camps. In total, the Nazis will kill 11 million people, over half of whom, 6 million, are Jewish. Yes?
What is a Jehovah's Witness?
Jehovah's Witnesses are a small branch of Christianity, and they tend to be very opposed to swearing allegiance or loyalty to like political entities. So, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses in America won't recite the Pledge of Allegiance, which I suspect most of you probably didn't have to deal with. But like as a child, I was required to like recite a pledge of loyalty to the flag every morning at school, and I had a Jehovah's Witness classmate who would not do that. What's that?
My mom had.
Yeah. So the Jehovah's Witnesses are another. It's a small religious branch of Christianity that was also specifically targeted. But they're a pretty tiny group, so the numbers there are not as big. So 11 million victims of the Holocaust, 6 million of them Jewish. This is not just in Germany either. This spreads to all of the countries that Germany invades. So like the largest ghetto in the world is in Warsaw. It's the single most industrialized act of mass murder that has ever occurred. And it is our obligation as human beings to refuse any attempt by people to turn our hearts away from other humans. Anytime you see somebody trying to replace the idea of people as flesh and blood individuals, as real people with some story, particularly some frightening story of who those folks are, we need to recognize that for what it is, which is manufactured hatred. And anytime you see people trying to turn your eyes away or make it impossible to see human rights violations or things that are occurring, you have to recognize that for what it is, which is the preconditions for this kind of horror. And that is our obligation. Now, Lise Meitner does get out. She does escape. And she continues to work with Otto Hahn from a distance. He does the experiment that they had planned, which, if you'll recall from yesterday, involved firing neutrons at uranium atoms in the hopes of making an element heavier than uranium. But Otto Hahn can't make sense of his results, and so he writes to Lise Meitner, sends her the results, and she's able to explain exactly what's going on. What she realizes is he had started with uranium, which is an element with 92 protons. And what they had ended up with after firing these neutrons at it is two separate elements. One is barium, which is the element with 56 protons, the other of which is krypton, which is the element with 36 protons. And if you add those numbers together, you'll realize, oh, 56 plus 36, that is 92 protons. So what has happened is they've actually accidentally split the nucleus of a uranium atom into two smaller atoms. So this idea that the atom can't be split, completely thrown out. Yes?
Are these two chemically very made elements?
No, these are naturally occurring elements. Barium and krypton both occur in nature. Barium and krypton.
Oh wait, so but how do you know if it's not a naturally occurring element?
Anything heavier than uranium is synthetic.
Wait, so this
How
makes
heavy
it.
is uranium?
200 and there's a couple different isotopes, but about 238 atomic mass units.
So this makes them realize that like they can be split in half.
We can indeed split the atom, and not only can we split the atom, but the amount of matter in barium and krypton doesn't quite add up to the amount of matter in uranium. It's like very slightly matter. A tiny bit of mass disappears, and a huge amount of energy is created. So what they actually find is that law of conservation of mass, not actually 100% true. You can turn matter into energy, and it's a lot of energy. And this is enough energy to power a city or to level it.
So she by accidentally splits an atom.
Accidentally splits an atom, yeah.
Wait, enough energy to level 3?
Yeah. This is the technology behind nuclear bombs.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what you
Should I?
Yeah, you can put it on the wall.